So in terms of the overview of the presentation today, I crafted the keynote around the same think piece that we were invited to write some months ago. So we'll look at trust as an expectation of student conduct, trust as a matter of professional conduct, institutional trust, trust as a role of addressing misconduct. Finally, I'll conclude with a call to action, give you the slides I promised, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. Because I work in academic integrity, plagiarism, exam cheating, I feel compelled to share the provenance of this work with you. Today's talk is drawn from two works. Firstly, a monograph, Plagiarism in Higher Education, and the second is the second handbook of academic integrity that was mentioned earlier. The second handbook was published this year in 2024. It's considered a major reference work in the field, comprised of 3 volumes, almost 2,000 pages, 112 chapters from 145 contributing authors. I say, try and get the libraries to buy it, because the publisher sets the price. But before we get into the topic of today, I kind of wanted to set the stage with a little bit of vocabulary. One of the things that irritates me as a scholar and activist in academic integrity is when people use terms in inaccurate ways. On the screen here you see a continuum that I built together with a couple of graduate students a few years ago. At one end, we have academic integrity, which includes skill building, education, advocacy, communication of expectations. These are things we try to promote in our institutions. But then there comes a moment if you're a professor, and you may suspect or see a breach of integrity. You'll see that on the line in the continuum is the middle line. We call that the critical incident. That's the moment where the instructor says, uh-oh, something's gone wrong, or I think something's wrong. What do I do? Who do I talk to? Where are the policies? Oh no, I don't know what to do. And that's a gray zone in the middle for many professors or teachers or educators. They might consult a colleague, a department head, a policy, and there can be a lot of emotional labor here for the person who is for the first time or the second time or the 10th time or 100th time seeing an act of academic misconduct. Then we move to the other part of the continuum where we engage in breaches of integrity or violations of integrity. Misconduct, plagiarism, cheating, fraud, corruption, bribery, and on the list goes. In many universities, we'll have an investigation process, a case management process, sanctions, an appeal process, and so on. But let's get the vocabulary straight. We don't deal with academic integrity. We promote academic integrity, even celebrate integrity. We deal with breaches. We deal with violations. But integrity itself is something not only to aspire to, but to practice every day. So the next time you hear somebody say, I'm dealing with a case of integrity, say, really? What does that mean, to deal with integrity? Question them. Ask them to clarify what they mean. Academic integrity should not be a euphemism for plagiarism. And yet, if you've worked in higher education or education in general for any length of time, whoops. There we go. Swapping it out. No? Yes? Oh, that one. All right. Swapping it out. Thank you. All right. If you worked in education for any length of time, you may think of academic misconduct like this, that all students are cheating and all students are bad students. And we've only got a very small percentage of students who are the good students, right? Especially if your job involves case management or appeals. This can be soul-crushing work as educators. And we think that people who intentionally cheat are everywhere. But this is a skewed view. This is really a bell curve of normal. This curve is adapted from a woman named Deborah Brody who wrote a book just called Cheating. It's a very interesting book. She's got a section on academic cheating, a section on cheating in relationships, a section on financial cheating. It's a gripping read. She doesn't have this bell curve, but she talks about a bell curve of normal in her book. And at one end of the bell curve, we have people who never cheat. Gosh, we wish all our students were like them. And at the other end of the bell curve, we have people who are the serial cheaters. And no matter what you do, they will always cheat. There's some kind of pathology there. I'm not a psychiatrist, but you can understand what we talk about when we talk about a serial cheater. And in the middle, there's the rest of us. the rest of us who are normal. And if you put us under the wrong circumstances at the wrong time, we might make the wrong decision. I often tell people, I don't get up in the morning and polish my halo to do this work. We all come to this work with our own stories. And I mentioned yesterday in Doc Week that I recall copying from the Encyclopedia Britannica in grade 3, which gives you an idea of how old I am. But I continue to remember that. So I have a colleague at Swansea University in Wales, his name's Professor Phil Newton, and he puts it very simply. He says, people cheat, and students are people. That I think is worth remembering. I put it differently. I say students are not our enemy, they are our future. I'll say that again because I think it's a key message that I want to convey today, that students are not our enemy, they are our future. Academic integrity is framed in different ways depending where you come from. This model, we talked about it yesterday during Doc Week, is used in the United States of America. It was started by a group there who run the International Center for Academic Integrity, framing academic integrity around a set of 6 values: courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. And often within this framework, there's all kinds of resources about how to use this framework. It's framed within the context of what students should do. Students should act honestly. Students have a responsibility to know the rules and follow the rules. Students should trust their professors. Students should trust the system if there's a finding of misconduct. I'm not sure that's the case always. The one I'd like to kind of touch upon and pause with is around responsibility. This one goes something like this in the free resources. Students have a responsibility to know the policies and follow the policies. At some universities, there are no policies, or the policies are embedded so deeply on a website that not even the most seasoned administrator can find them easily. And yet we expect students to know them and follow them. Students might also have responsibilities that are different. They might have responsibilities to peer and social groups to help one another succeed. That might come in the form of sharing notes with classmates as a peer responsibility. Coming from Canada, I often hear colleagues say, oh yes, international students do this. But in North America, especially in the United States, there are these things called fraternities and sororities that have had decades-long expectations of members of those Greek societies to share their notes and tests and essays and assignments. There's a pejorative term used in the United States called frat files, short for fraternity files, and it is an expectation of members that they will in fact share their academic work. This was, if you ask me, the precursor to Chegg and Course Hero. And back in the days, those files were held in boxes in the houses of the members. So I challenge my colleagues and say, academic file sharing is nothing new. It didn't start with the pandemic. It's not limited to international students. North American students championed this for the better part of 100 years. We have evidence in newspapers going back that long. So frameworks like this can be a starting point for a conversation with students about what values guide their learning. We had a similar conversation yesterday about this at Doc Week. But this is not the only framing of academic integrity. In fact, in the United States, there are different views on this. So one of the chapters in the handbook I wrote with an American colleague, and we looked at some of the literature from the US, and there's a fairly strong polarization around academic integrity. It might be difficult to imagine American politics and education being polarized. But work with me on this. So there's one group who says it's about the morality and the values and the character education and people making good decisions and being good people. And there's another group of people that say, no, it has nothing to do with that. This is an academic literacy issue. And you can still plagiarize and be a good person. Wow. That really upsets the people that think of this through a morality lens. And an interesting thing here is that 2 of the prominent scholars, one of them being Don McCabe, who since passed away, and the other, in the other category, her name's Rebecca Moore-Howard, she's still with us, they worked across the state lines from each other at the same time. So McCabe worked in New Jersey at Rutgers University, and Rebecca Moore Howard worked at Syracuse University in New York at the same time, and they never worked together. They never went to the same conferences. They orbited around each other and actually avoided each other. So I ask you, where do you sit? Do you see academic integrity as a skills development issue or a morality issue? Maybe you're not sure. But there's still yet other framings. In a project that we undertook at the University of Calgary, was led by my friend and colleague, Kita Gladue, she looked at a project called Indigenous Academic Integrity. And the iconography that you see on the screen is one that she developed in conversation and consultation with community, looking at Indigenous values. So Kita is a member of the Sucker Creek Cree Nation and a Métis woman in Western Canada living in Alberta. And through some of the teachings of Indigenous scholars, she looks at academic integrity differently as relationality. I am because you are, drawing here on Sean Wilson's work. And reciprocity in the roles we serve. And here she quotes from Hart saying, inherent in this commitment to the people is the understanding of reciprocity of life and accountability to one another. These ideas don't feature in the Eurocentric American teachings that we've seen before. And finally, respect, of nothing about us without us. And here she draws on the work of Smith, saying Indigenous knowledge extends beyond the environment. However, it has values and principles about human behavior and ethics, about relationships, about wellness and leading a good life. Knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. Here there are some echoes of morality, but more about responsibility. So this framing of Indigenous academic integrity stands as a complement and a challenge to existing frameworks that have been the dominant voice for many decades now. So one thing I wanted to share here is that our understanding of academic integrity is contextually and culturally constructed. We don't all mean the same thing when we talk about academic integrity. There's no universal definitions. What might appear in your university policies might not appear in mine, or they might be framed differently. And understanding that there are cultural implications here. So my question to you is, what does academic integrity mean to you in your context? And how does trust factor in? We can turn now to thinking about trust as a matter of professional conduct. And I've heard the conversations over the past few days about how academic integrity is not only a matter of student conduct, but students expect us as professors to model ethical behavior and ethical decision-making. I'm going to draw on some examples here that will highlight the ways in which professors continue to maybe not act with integrity. Some of you may be familiar with the sex for grade schemes or the sex for mark schemes that exist. In North America, we hear about these happening principally in countries like Kenya or Nigeria. If you haven't seen the BBC video on this, I encourage you to watch it. It's about an hour long, so we won't have time to talk about it together today. But it is illuminating and difficult to watch the girls who are being interviewed as they talk about the ways in which their professors demand sex from them in exchange for grades. The video is from 2018, but here's a news story from May of 2024 that the practice of insisting on... Thank you, now I know the trick. The practice of insisting on sexual favors in exchange for grades or marks continues. And then students themselves are starting to take action to bring this to the media for their attention by posting videos on social media platforms. So this for me was an interesting twist on this because the students now are taking the matter into their own hands and going to social media because the matter was not addressed adequately by their university administration. And when university administrations turn a blind eye to key ethical breaches, students will say, how can you expect us to act with integrity when you yourselves are not acting with integrity? So it starts with us as the educators and administrators. But just so you don't think that I'm picking on African countries, I'll dwell for a few minutes on my own country. Coming from Canada, we have a legacy called the residential school legacy. It's when the colonists came and started boarding schools for the Indian children, and the children were taken away from their families and put into these residential schools so they could be civilized, starting in the 1800s. The last of these schools was finally shut down in the 1970s, I think it was, maybe the 80s. But there is now a legacy of multi-generational trauma that existed in these schools here, and this is now, we are beginning to learn about this, the stories are coming forward. I say we, because this was not part of the history that I learned, but it is part of the history that young people today are learning about. But this quotation from this document talks about staff not being accountable for how they treated children, and that thousands of children suffered from physical and sexual abuse, and the schools hurt the children. And the damages inflicted by residential schools continue to this day. Now when we hear Indigenous colleagues and others talk with us about the trauma that they experienced or their parents experienced at the hands of white settlers, often associated with churches, in the name of civilizing the Indians and the harm that it caused, I look at that as now as someone, an educator, and say it's up to us to continue the conversations and to do better with this. So we're not immune. Last year I had the opportunity to travel to a different province in Canada, to British Columbia, to the city of Kamloops. If you were watching international news a couple of years ago, you may have heard about the cases of unmarked graves of hundreds and then thousands of small Indigenous children who were found on the sites of the lands around these schools. This was the first site. 215 unidentified, unmarked children's bodies were found on the property. And this started scientific investigations at the sites of other residential schools, and they've now discovered more than 10,000 unmarked graves. This is part of the Canadian legacy that we have. Now at this site, now they have a healing garden with 215 different Indigenous plants, one to represent each child, looking towards growth and healing and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So these stories are part of our past and our present and our future. But it's not the only story. This is another news story. Again, so I'm not picking on any one country. This is from Canada as well, from the province of Ontario near Toronto. A professor who was charged criminally in April of this year after he had alleged that some students had committed plagiarism and had said, I can report you to the school and you will be expelled. Or you can come to my home, to my basement, and I will beat you with a stick and you will accept your punishment, but you will not be expelled from the school. All of the students were international students. This is a professor who had been teaching for more than 20 years. He knew the rules, and he decided to violate them anyway. The students empowered themselves and went to the authorities. And in this case, there was enough of them, and the students were loud enough that a criminal investigation was conducted, and now this man is being held responsible for his actions and being punished. So I'm sharing this with you to show that these transgressions don't exist only in one place. These are not the stories of particular students in any one particular country, because if these is happening in one country, it's happening everywhere. And it's only the odd ones that will end up making the news. So the point here is that we must hold ourselves accountable as educators and administrators so our students can trust us. Because if they can't trust us, what are we here for? As professionals, we must model the behavior that we want our students to follow. And this, I think, I shared in the piece as well, the think piece. And this is not always easy, especially when we see people around us who may be committing unethical acts for students. And we think, well, if I report them, what will happen? Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe I will lose my job. And this is when it will take courage for us to take action against this. But let's move on. and think about institutional trust. Some of the work that I do as an academic integrity scholar was deeply informed by another scholar who has since passed away. Her name was Tracy Brettag. She looked at the development of policies, among other things, other research that she did for academic integrity and academic misconduct. And together with her team, she came up with sort of 5 core elements of exemplary academic integrity policies. So if you have a plagiarism policy or an academic integrity policy and you're thinking, how do we know that it's a good policy? There are frameworks to follow. This is the one that she started, but that a Canadian team has since adapted. So Tracy Brettag and her team started with access and approach, responsibility, detail, and support. So I'll leave equity to the end. Access means how easy is it for students to access the policy? We want the students to know what the policies are, but we don't always make it easy for them to find. What is the approach of the policy? Is it too detailed? Is it too legalistic? Can people actually understand it? Or is it not detailed enough? And in the policies, does it talk about who has what responsibilities? What are the responsibilities of students? How many policies have I looked at in the research we've done with our teams that don't outline any responsibilities for professors except to report cheating? But I would like to contend that there are further responsibilities for us in order to build trust in our institutions. And the level of detail in these policies. Is it excessive? Is it insufficient? Looking at where is the sweet spot. But in addition to policies, we also need other supports for students. Writing support, paraphrasing support, student experience support for them. Our Canadian team has conducted analysis of more than 200 policies at Canadian universities and colleges through this framing, and we found a big gap that wasn't part of the conversation when Professor Brettag was doing her work with colleagues that was published in 2011, but we found that equity was completely absent from the policy discussion. There was no discussion about students who we would consider to be from equity deserving groups, disabled students, persons of color, international students, students for whom English is a second language. We have this approach in our policies that one size fits all, which comes back to administrative law roots for this, but we're like, does one size fit all? And some policies from some universities, you see these very nice and neat matrices that will say something like, if it's a first offense, if it's minor, this is the punishment. If it's a second offense, if it's moderate, this is the punishment. And we use these models of progressive discipline so that the outcome for someone who might have committed more than one act, subsequent acts, might be expulsion from the university. We're like, what if one size doesn't fit all? What if now in our conversations that we're having around decolonization, indigenization, equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, what if these factored into our policies for misconduct? And what if not all misconduct is actually misconduct? So I have Australian colleagues that talk instead about poor academic practice, students having insufficient academic literacy skills. In Ireland, they use the term academic impoverishment. We think about poverty in terms of finances, shelter, food, but what about when students come with the poverty of not knowing what's expected of them in universities and may have a poverty of skills? Why should we punish that? How can we help students build their trust in us as educators and our institutions by lifting them up rather than punishing them for their academic impoverishment? And thinking about the ways that we address misconduct, often it will be framed in terms of this fairness triangle in which things should be procedural, how are decisions made about misconduct in terms of plagiarism. There we go, got it now, great. This fairness triangle talks about relational and how was I treated. But I find this jarring when I compare this to my Indigenous colleague, Kita Gladu, and she talks about relationality in terms of one person to another person. This talks about a process. I'm not convinced that a process can actually be relational. But then it also talks about substantive, what was decided, was the finding, did the outcome fit the act of misconduct. But this fairness triangle is used a lot. This graphic is from the University of British Columbia in Canada, but it's used in various universities. But I'm not sure that this triangle is the be-all and end-all of the ways that we should think about misconduct. I'm not sure that the ways that we actually address misconduct now help us to build trust. We have these individual efforts, we have educators who care so much, professional staff who care so much, but individual efforts alone are not enough. We need institutional systems and policies and procedures that exist and are followed and help us to build trust and are not predicated on the idea that students are our enemy. We need institutional policies and procedures that help us focus on students as our future. That conversation would change things dramatically. I wanted to talk a little bit about the typical approaches to academic misconduct that exist in many of our universities and why I think we can do better, and how I think we can do better. In many of our universities now, if there's a finding of plagiarism or exam cheating, there will be what we would go through as a punitive approach to a misconduct finding. So there would be an investigation, there would be a punishment or a sanction that's handed down to the student. This is based on administrative law. Certainly in North America, it's based on the British parliamentary system. And I mentioned this before, the escalation, the progressive discipline model. The more egregious the offense, the worse the punishment. The more times you've committed the offense, the worse the punishment. And at the end of it all, the worst punishment we can give the student is to exclude them or expel them from the university. This is very common in academic integrity policies or misconduct policies around the world. However, things are beginning to change, but slowly. Now, in some universities, there's what they call an educational model. First offense, so the student doesn't know how to cite and reference properly. That might not be punishable. Maybe you need some writing support, citation referencing support, paraphrasing support. We have people who can help you with that. Maybe as an outcome of a misconduct case, there might be some additional education. We had this in our recent policy at the University of Calgary in 2019, and there was the list of possible punishments. So I challenged our vice provost. I still have a job. I challenged our vice provost and said, well, why would we call it punishment? Can we call it outcomes or consequences? Can we decriminalize our language around this so that we are not treating students as criminals for a matter of plagiarism or academic impoverishment? She said, okay, yeah, we can do that. Then we got to the list of punishments or the sanctions, and one of them was a mandatory workshop. And I said, oh, okay, we are an institution of learning. And yet we have learning as a punishment. And she said, oh yeah, we can call it an outcome, but it's still got to be mandatory. So we're punishing students with more learning. But it's still better than just a punishment because at least we give them a chance to learn a little bit more, so maybe they won't make the same mistake. But there are some exciting possibilities that have yet to be fully explored in Canada and beyond. There are 1 or 2 universities in Canada that are using restorative approaches to academic misconduct, restorative justice for academic misconduct. Pushed largely by Indigenous communities who are saying your Western colonial ways of dealing with misconduct don't work for us. We use restorative justice in our criminal justice system in some cases, but we have yet to implement it for student conduct. And in restorative approaches, the process seeks to repair harm rather than to punish an act. So the idea in a restorative conference is that first it would be discussed of what harm was committed and to whom, and how do we repair the harms in relationships. And it focuses on community building and long-term relationships. There are organizations that offer training. The International Institute for Restorative Practices is one of them. I've done some basic training, but my university has yet to entertain the idea of using an alternative form of justice for academic misconduct, because such processes can be expensive and time-intensive. All parties need to agree to a restorative justice approach, and it's not appropriate in all cases. If the individual is not willing to take responsibility for the alleged transgression, this won't work. But the ultimate outcome of a restorative approach is not to exclude the student, but to keep them in the community. The idea is you belong. We want you here. You are part of the community. So how do we rebuild the trust with you so we can trust you and you can trust us? And sometimes in these restorative conferences around misconduct, we can say, okay, who has been harmed? The teacher who says, you've wasted my time, it took me all this time to prepare this case, and other students in the class may say, you cheated, and that offends us because we're doing our work honestly. So other students can come into the conversation. Every now and again, the person who, the accused, if you will, can say, and yet the institution has also harmed me. Or I have been harmed by other professors. So all parties can discuss the harm and then talk about a path forward together so that the ultimate outcome is not to eject somebody from the community, but to keep them in and to rebuild the trust. I would like to contend that if we're looking at productive ways to address misconduct, although this won't work in all ways, this won't work with the outliers of that bell curve of normal that have some kind of pathology that no matter what you do, they're going to cheat. But in many cases, for the 80 to 90% of us who are normal, and if you put us in the wrong place at the wrong time and we make the wrong decision, how many of us would like the chance to stay and rebuild the relationship and continue to be part of the community? This, I think, offers a path forward that merits our attention. One of the things that we don't talk about when it comes to academic misconduct is the role of human rights. I have never heard this discussed in my own university until I brought it up and keep bringing it up. Often we start with an assumption that the student is guilty. I will hear professors say, but I saw them cheat in the exam. Or I know they've used ChatGPT. That's a new one. We start with an assumption of guilt, often, and go straight to prosecution. But if we look to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we would start with a presumption of innocence, even if we have witnessed the act. And we would have a due process for the individual. The UN Declaration of Human Rights talks about a public trial. We don't have that for academic misconduct in many of our universities. We would have a closed investigation, for example. But we do talk about the presumption of innocence and the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty. In how many of our cases around academic misconduct do we afford students the same thing that the UN Declaration of Rights says we should have for criminals? And in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the word dignity is mentioned no less than 6 times. But I've never seen it in an academic misconduct policy, and I've read hundreds of them. So when we put students through our process, to what extent do we try to maintain their dignity? And if anybody has been through a process in this room, you may not have felt that you were allowed to keep your dignity through the process. At the end of it all, I will go back to the words of my friend and colleague, Phil Newton, who says, people cheat, and students are people, and people deserve to be treated with dignity. Because if we don't start with dignity, we can't have trust. There's an awful lot about equity and human rights and dignity that merit our consideration for academic misconduct. It's not about us against the students. It's not about the good guys and the bad guys. It's not about the cheaters and the good people, because we don't all come to work or to school wearing our halos. One of the things that I would like to further challenge us when we're addressing academic misconduct is to think about the ways that one size fits all doesn't work. It's in our policies and procedures often that we have this one size fits all, but if we care about equity and inclusion and accessibility and decolonization, we must also care about the individuals and the human beings behind these acts. I would like to contend that many of the ways that we deal with misconduct that are based in administrative law perpetuates colonialism, perpetuates the ways that we continue to inflict harm with the processes that we have for our students. And as long as we continue to perpetuate colonialism, we cannot create trust with our students. We talk about decolonization in our universities and restoration and restitution. Until we extend that beyond our classrooms to looking at student conduct and also professional misconduct, we will not be able to fully realize our efforts around this. And I would encourage you to think about and challenge the ways in which that we deal with misconduct as a form of perpetuation of colonialism, and that we can do better, and we must do better for our students, because after all, they are our future and not our enemy. So I know that we want lots of time for questions, so I'll conclude with a recap of the key messages, and that so that you can have some takeaways here, and that our notions of academic and research integrity are culturally and contextually constructed. What does integrity mean to you in your context, and how might it differ? There are no universal definitions of integrity, misconduct, plagiarism, cheating. And I think as a global community, if we want to talk about building trust with one another, exchanging those ideas is an important part of the conversation. And as professionals, we must demand of one another that we act in the way that we want our students to act as well. We are not exempt. And the higher we go up the administrative chain, the higher up in the ranks we go in academia, it does not absolve us of our responsibilities, but rather increases our responsibilities for it. And that our institutional systems and policies and procedures must not only exist, but be followed and be revised and updated and decolonized and focus on trust and dignity, because human rights are a fundamental part of education and therefore are a fundamental part of academic and research integrity. We cannot have trust without integrity, and we cannot have integrity without trust. So I'll conclude with a call to action before we move into our question period. And my call to action to you is this: first of all, trust your students. Trust that most of them are normal. And when you come across that student that cheats again and again and again, remind yourself the student is the outlier. They are not the norm. And I want to be here for the 80 to 90% of the normal students, as well as those who never cheat, God bless them. But I want to be here for those students, and I will not be dragged down by the occasional outlier who repeatedly cheats. That's not why I became an educator. So my call to action to you, the first one, is to trust your students, and also trust that you are not alone, and you are part of a global community dedicated to ethics and integrity in education, and to trust itself, or you wouldn't be here. And finally, to trust yourself. As educators, we have these moments when we wonder to ourselves, am I good enough? Am I doing the right thing? Is this the right decision? Those are normal questions to ask ourselves. But I would contend, as I conclude this preliminary or this first keynote for the conference, that trust is not a goal to be achieved, but a daily practice of living and leading and learning. And there will be those moments when we don't trust, and then we can come back and trust again the next day. So it's not that we get up one day and we have all this trust and the next day we don't, but rather just this daily practice of engaging in trust as much as we can. And when we have those breaches of trust, reminding ourselves sometimes that's normal, but it doesn't mean that is breaches of trust are the norm. And we will continue to work every day to build our trust with ourselves, our students, and one another. Thank you for your time.